Okay, welcome back. So in this video, what I want to do is I want to take primacy, I want to take the attention away from Paul, and I want to place emphasis on other members of the early church experience. There's about 5 names that I want to drop here other than Paul, or I should say 4 names other than Paul. I want to talk about Paul briefly, but there's about 5 different schools of thought that we might want to pay attention to. Technically, I would say there's probably about 20 that we would want to pay attention to. If we're looking at multiple historical documents, we would probably lay them side by side. For our purposes, I think it's actually quite a lot to just even briefly mention these 5 leaders, voices in the early church, and kind of see how they are debating and moving against one another, moving with one another in certain ways. So let's kind of go with this. First name I want to drop is I want to drop Peter. First and foremost, because Jesus seems to say to Peter directly, you should be the head of the church. You should take this message that I have put down and you should take it forward beyond my life, death, and resurrection. You should go further with this. And to some extent, we do see Peter doing this, at least initially. Peter is presents a very different image depending on who we are looking at and which version of Peter we're looking at. One thing that I would draw attention to is that Peter is very outspoken, he's very impetuous, he has a fishing industry that he's able to leave out of dedication to Jesus. Checkpoint 1, I would say, maybe it's not that clear. If we are looking at historical records, we see that taxes are being increased on food and folkways and fisheries, things that are that make a lot of sense to us here in Louisiana, sportsman's paradise, that when taxes are going up on disposable things like food, there comes a breaking point where it's no longer financially advantageous to farm or to fish just because the taxes are cost prohibitive. So when Peter leaves his fishing industry, when the sons of Zebedee leave their fishing industry, it's not as clear cut as saying, well, there's this guy that was just kind of walking around and says a couple of interesting things, and then they're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to leave everything that I know. I'm going to leave everything that's financially advantageous for me. I'm going to throw that all away, and I'm going to follow this guy who just said like 5 really cool things. No, what's probably more honest historically is if we say, or if we recognize that there are a number of reasons why Peter and the sons of Zebedee will leave their industry and will follow Jesus. But Peter is very outspoken in the same way that the sons of Zebedee are also very outspoken about their self-interests, about the things that they believe, about the things that they believe about Jesus. I mean, there does come a point where Peter says he's willing to kill in Jesus' name, and Jesus says, whoa, buddy, let's slow that down. I didn't call you to do that. I didn't even ask you to do that. I don't know where you would get that. Put your sword away. And then goes a step further and says, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. So it's not just that he's saying in this particular circumstance, he's saying anyone who is willing to exercise violence in the name of God, we probably want to pause and we want to think about that. Peter goes on. He plays a very important role in the first half of the book of Acts. He has a vision, specifically, that will open up the message or the Christian message to all peoples, not just fellow Jews, but to the entire world. And Peter here again seems to kind of pump the brakes and say, I don't know about that one. And Jesus, through a divine revelation, has to step in and say, look, you need to stop objecting to everything that I'm telling you to do. If I'm trying to save the whole world, I'm trying to save the whole world. But then Peter, in the process of doing that, the next time that we see Peter, he will be eating with the Jewish leaders, will be trying to convert them. And Paul, who is another voice at the table of this early church, Paul will step in and say, Peter, this thing that you're doing, that you're continually trying to go back to the thing that Jesus has called you away from, that's not good. You really have to stop that. Further, it seems curious that Peter would take on this effort to try and save the Jewish people when Paul is the one who is most vested in the Jewish faith. Let's pause. We'll come back to that one. So another voice. So Peter is one voice. The next voice that we want to pay attention to is James, who, according to the legends of the early church, is most likely one of the brothers of Jesus. So think about this. This is someone who grew up with Jesus, who would have not only known Jesus as a miracle worker, who would have kind of given his life to the message that Jesus taught, would, I mean, in no other way could we kind of dismiss this. He definitely is looking up to Jesus as an older brother, is trying to kind of do the things that Jesus would have done, if nothing else, right? And James embodies a very different voice at the table. James places great emphasis on faith in practice. In fact, in the book of James, one of the later books of the Christian scriptures, James will drop several very curious claims that will contradict Paul. And one of those is that James will say, faith without works is dead, meaning that you can't go around saying that you believe in Jesus if there are not works that follow that. This doesn't mean, well, I believe in Jesus and so I'm going to kind of do small things along the way. No, James says there is no divide between these two. It's not as though faith is over here and then, if you're able to get to it, get to works later. James says faith without those works is dead. It doesn't even matter. He will also continue along this line of thought and will make other claims to this effect, essentially saying that you have to put your faith into practice. It's not enough to believe a thing in your heart and you believe in Jesus and think that you can go to heaven. No, James says, you're not even in the game. You're not even part of this community unless you are willing to take action on the things that you say that you believe in. Curious statement, that, particularly in light of what the religious experience is in America, which places great emphasis on your personal, individual heart experience with no actions that follow, with nothing else that reflects that. You can live like the devil as long as you have Jesus in your heart. James would say, not only are those claims incompatible, you make a mockery of the faith entirely by trying to live that way. Not say those things, but actually live those things. You make a mockery of the faith. Let's move on. Paul, who James, it seems, is offering a corrective to, Paul will make all kinds of claims that will go against what James is saying, specifically in collecting together Paul's theology, specifically looking at the book of Romans and the book of Galatians. Paul will lay down the gospel, the good news, not as salvation from empire, not as salvation to heaven, not as a fulfillment of the prophets, not in any capacity echoing or reflecting the things that Jesus has said. Paul will instead offer a different gospel, one that says you are justified by faith alone. Paul makes no claims like James does, saying that you need to live out your faith. In fact, Paul goes the extra mile in saying the things that you do don't matter. What matters is the condition of your heart, whether you have faith in Jesus or not. And if you do, then all is well with your soul. You will do good things because you are going to go to heaven, and you will maybe or not live that out. But then in Romans 7, Paul says, hey, I recognize what I'm saying seems to contradict what we know, meaning this Christian community, this Jewish community, this Jewish or Judeo-Christian community. Paul says, I recognize that, and I know a man, he's really talking about himself here in Romans 7. He says, I know a man who does bad things, who feels bad about it, and that's further evidence that he is saved, because you wouldn't feel bad about it unless also the Spirit of God resides in your heart and is convicting you and is offering you a witness. But the fact that you feel bad is evidence that you are already saved. Again, this is not what James, the brother of Jesus, is talking about. This is not what Jesus is talking about. This is not a message that Peter will teach. This is something completely different. I think Paul gets a large platform first and foremost because of the way that Luke talks about him in the book of Acts, the primacy that Luke will give Paul, and I don't think this is a big stretch because of the way that Paul's life really kind of transforms with the Damascus Road experience, which we talked about in our last video. Because Paul's salvation is instantaneous, there is emphasis placed on the immediacy of God's salvation through the power of Jesus and through the power of God's Spirit. And I think that that's a very compelling message. That's not something that should be discredited. But again, it's not the only voice at the table. So, recap. We've talked about Peter, who, for a number of reasons, should have been the head of the church, but the text does not support him as the head of the church. We've talked about James, who very much is the head of the church. The book of Acts records him as the head of the church councils in Jerusalem, which is the center of the Christian faith and the Christian message. Peter will come and will visit James as the center and head of the church in Jerusalem. Paul will also visit James as the head of the church in the center of Jerusalem. So it raises the question, kind of juggling these three people together, it raises the question, who is the head of the church? Is it the guy that Jesus kind of deputizes as the head of the church, but then never actually fulfills that role? In fact, what we see is that Peter really disappears from the story entirely. And not only that, but when we do see Peter, he is trying to go against the teachings of Jesus. He does this while Jesus is alive. He does this after Jesus is presumably resurrected. He is doing this later when Paul will have to step in and say, the way that you're living your life, it's contradictory to everything that Jesus would have taught. While also Paul is saying things that are contradictory to Jesus. So it raises the question, well, where is Peter in all of this? Well, according to the Catholic teachings, Peter is, he disappears from the story because he is the head of the church and will subsequently be deputized or be called the Pope of the official Roman Catholic Church. There's really just no textual evidence for that. And really, there's not a whole lot of historical evidence for that either. And the historical evidence that does exist, making Peter the head of the church, was written much, much later by Catholic theologians who were trying to rewrite that history. Interesting thing, that. What seems consistent from the book of Acts, from the writings of Paul, from the later writings of Peter, is that James is instead the head of the church in Jerusalem, which again is the center of the Christian community. But Paul is definitely given the largest platform, and I would say again because of this instantaneous change that he undergoes, because he is the most theological in his approach to Jesus and to this gospel message. He is the one who goes furthest, farthest, and fastest and strongest in pursuit of the Christian message. And so he is the one that by default starts to kind of bend the narrative. And that again, juggling those three, we have two other names that we want to drop here. That I think bends the Christian narrative in ways that are remarkable or worth remarking on, that are interesting, but again, which seemingly contradict not only what Jesus has to say, but really does some really fudgy things with the Tanakh, with the Torah, with the writings of the prophets, with the writings of the Hebrew scriptures. It does some very interesting things that I would say are not only anti-biblical, but are just not biblical. They just don't have support. Okay, next. We have John, who I think would be our fourth voice. So we have Peter, we have James, we have Paul, and then we come to John. Now, John presents what I would call this ethic of love, which I think I touched on in the last video. And John's message, John's gospel, is that love should be the defining characteristic and quality of a Christian in community with other Christians. Love should be that defining piece of the Christian narrative. Well, what does that mean exactly? In the Gospels, we have Jesus teaching about love, and someone says to him, well, teacher, how many times should I forgive someone? And, should I forgive someone 7 times? And Jesus says, well, you shouldn't just forgive them 7 times. You should forgive them 70 times 7. He is essentially saying, you're thinking too small. You need to forgive period. Like, whatever the number is, just forgive it. In this, we would see a lot of the core teachings that will be picked up later with John when he is writing his Ethic of Love. But this does not kind of follow suit with the other voices, primarily because John is not as theological, I would say. So I was going to say he's not as theological as Paul. I would just say that John is not theological. It seems as though John is very central on this message that love should be the defining character quality, should be the defining ethic of the Christians, and he just doesn't really lay off of that. Love can mean many things, though, right? I mean, in 2025, you're watching this video, love can mean many things. If you've been in a relationship that went south, that went sour, that was dangerous or abusive, love can take all kinds of different forms. So I might say, to kind of simplify the entire discussion, is love a thing that you say? Is love a thing that you show? Is love a thing that you behave? Is love a thing that you forgive? All of this is applicable. I would say love is so broad that John doesn't try and work that out. He kind of leaves it to you in individual circumstances to understand. You will have to decide what is the most loving thing, and forgiveness is part of that. I mean, Jesus is kind of laying the foundation here that forgiveness is love, love is forgiveness. John will go much further in that and say that love takes many forms. In fact, love covers a multitude of sins. And then finally, we come to our fifth voice here. And on this one, this is not one voice, this is many voices that are collected together. So I refer to this fifth voice as the Marys. The Marys would be Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary of Magdala, and then Mary of Bethany. And just to kind of survey the Gospels and the New Testament is that we see that Mary, the mother of Jesus, is a very important figure, primarily because she is the one that God chooses to bring Jesus into the world. She is seen as a virtuous person, and then we kind of move past that. We don't really see Mary except at the periphery of the Jesus stories. We see Mary show up at one point while Jesus is doing his teaching ministry, and the people, not Mary, but the people that are in the crowds, they approach Jesus and they say, Teacher, your mother and your brothers are here. And Jesus dismisses them really quickly, and he says, who's my mother and brothers? The ones who are actually doing the work of God and bringing about God's kingdom. He doesn't, according to the story, he doesn't stop. He doesn't have lunch with them. He doesn't pause. He doesn't welcome his mother and his brothers into the group. He just says, well, who's my mother and who's my brothers? And then he moves on and he continues to teach. We see Mary finally at the cross when Jesus is crucified. And in that capacity, we can imagine, how she would have reacted to seeing her son dying, how traumatic that would have been. And in the Gospel of John, we see Jesus saying to the beloved disciple, presumably John, to care for his mother. And then Mary more or less kind of disappears from the story. We see her in Acts 2 with the fulfillment of the Spirit at the Feast of Pentecost. But Mary virtually disappears from the story, which is not necessarily remarkable because we've seen other figures who entirely disappear from the story. First and foremost among them, because I just talked about him, is that Peter disappears from the story. We don't know where Mary goes after this. So Mary shows up, but there's certainly something about Mary at the start of the Jesus narratives that she has chosen to bring God into the world, that she is there as part of his story. She is continually trying to press in through the crowd and say, I am here, I am still with you, I'm still paying attention. She is there at the foot of Jesus' crucifixion as part of the great sorrows that would have been attached to the crucifixion of the Savior. And then she is there finally in the book of Acts, fulfilling the promises of God with the coming of God's Spirit. Next, we see Mary of Magdala, which according to church tradition, she was a prostitute. That's debatable. We don't exactly see that in the Gospels, but according to the tradition, she is a prostitute who comes to Jesus. I think it might be safer and a little bit kinder to say that Mary clearly has a great deal of money. that she will give to Jesus, that will help fund Jesus' ministry, that will quite literally help to feed Jesus and his followers. She is there giving time, attention, and resources. So whatever her history may have been or may not have been, it seems pretty clear that she is also showing up. And then finally, we have Mary of Bethany, who I would say is the third of the three Marys that I'm talking about here. And so Mary of Bethany shows up as a sister of Lazarus. She seems to, when the name Mary shows up, and is not speaking of Mary Magdala or Mary, the mother of Jesus. The only other Mary that we have, according to the Gospels, is a woman who will show up and will give tremendous attention to washing and anointing the feet of Jesus, to sitting at the feet of Jesus and paying attention to his teachings. So she is like right there paying attention to what Jesus has to say. Beyond that, explicitly, we have Mary as the sister of Lazarus, Jesus' friend. The only person that we see Jesus crying over or weeping over is the death of Lazarus. So clearly this is someone whose family Jesus would have been familiar with. He would have probably known Mary of Bethany, would have been good friends with her, and it seems as though she is right there listening to Jesus as well. Apocryphal legends, these are not in the canon of the Christian scriptures. These are extra stories that exist. And according to the Da Vinci Code, which was a popular book and then a popular movie, and according to The Last Temptation of Christ by Martin Scorsese, who is a lifelong Catholic himself, it seems plausible that either Mary of Magdala or Mary of Bethany would have been a wife of Jesus. This is the most likely assumption. If we believe that Jesus had a girlfriend at any point, it would have probably been one of these two women. And so in this, I would say what we have is kind of this mishmash, this amalgamation of Marys together. Again, Mary, the mother of God, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary of Magdala, and Mary of Bethany. And so we also want to make sure that we are paying attention to the voice of women who were part of the early church experience. So much attention is given to these big names of Peter, James, John, Paul, all men who have a very different perspective on relations and on the role of women in the church that, again, seem to be contradictory at times to what Jesus is talking about in his ministry. Specifically, Paul writes about how a woman should not speak in a church. He speaks about how a woman should behave herself in society. He speaks about how a wife should submit herself to her husband. Paul doesn't record anything himself in his letters about having a wife. In fact, he goes to great lengths to tell the early churches, I wish that all people were like I were, which is single and unattached. I think that shapes a lot of your theology, right? If women are not important to you, if you are not married, if you do not have a family, if you do not have someone that you are dependent on in any way, that you are not responsible for in any way, I think it certainly shapes your theology. Peter, it seems as though Peter is married. I mean, in the Gospels, we have a mention of Peter's mother-in-law who is sick and infirm. Jesus shows up. There's no mention of Peter's wife. There's a mention of Peter's mother-in-law. There's not a mention of Peter's wife. And so, kind of trying to cobble this together, we might see that maybe Peter had a wife, maybe she lost a wife, or maybe he lost a wife. It's really unclear on that. James seems to elevate the role of women, not in James's own book, but in the book of Acts. It seems as though James is trying to elevate the role and the place of women in the church. Again, this is in contradiction to what Paul does in his own writings. And then finally, John is given responsibility for Mary, the mother of Jesus, when Jesus is dying on the cross, and then John will disappear and then will reappear in very short letters, greeting women, and then at the back end of the Christian scriptures, John will frame women as whores and harlots and all kinds of sexual deviance around women. And many people, given what John says about himself in the Gospel of John as the beloved disciple, given the anti-woman position that John puts forward in the book of Revelation, many people would kind of fill in the gaps and will say it kind of starts to sound like either John hates women, or if John doesn't hate women, then John might very well be gay. I mean, he may have had a romantic attraction to Jesus. So in all of this, what we see is whether it is Peter, whether it is Paul, whether it is James, whether it is John, it seems as at best there is a negligence towards women, and at worst would be a complete silencing and erasure of women. How do I know this? Where do I get this from? Well, think about this. Like, if Mary is the mother of Jesus, and Jesus's relation with Mary at the wedding of Cana is to say, why are you bothering me? If the next time we see Jesus and Mary together is that she shows up in a crowd and people say, not Mary saying this, but the people are saying this, hey, your mom is here. And he's like, well, who's my mom? And then he just kind of walks off and keeps talking. There is a character quality here where either Jesus and everyone that will follow with the early church, or a later writer who will erase women entirely from the story, kind of shines through. And I would say that doesn't seem supported by what Luke says in the book of Acts. It seems as though if you are including Mary at the coming of the Spirit of God, if you are saying that that is a fulfillment of the prophet Joel, who would have prophesied in the Hebrew scriptures about the Spirit of God being poured out on both men and women and on all kinds of people, if you are talking in the book of Acts about eunuchs and people who don't kind of fit this heteronormative expectation, it seems as though the book of Acts is trying to say, no, not only were women a big part of the church, they were leaders of the church. They are named in the letters of Paul. Paul will try and write them out of the story, but Paul is also saying, greet Priscilla, greet Aquila, who are leaders in the church. Greet this person who is a fellow servant of Jesus, who is a fellow missionary. It seems as though if we are looking at the periphery of these letters, the intros and the extras, women are not only there, they have a leading voice that at some point was erased from the story entirely. So where am I going with all this? Well, when we place our attention and our emphasis on Paul exclusively, we're really missing all of the other voices of the church. At best, we're missing the other 80% of the voices of the church, and by my survey of historical writings of the early church, I would say we're not just missing 80%, we're missing a lot more than that. We're missing comfortably 95, 97% of what was happening in the early church to focus on Paul's message of justification by faith, when, again, no one else seems to be teaching that. To try and say that that is the gospel message, the text just doesn't support that. The abundance of Paul's writings supports that, not the other texts, not the other examples, not the records that would support this. Not even Luke's own gospel would seem to support that that understanding of Jesus or Jesus' teachings.